I have read the file on Vael-Keth 4 times. I have read it in the long dark of the transit corridor when I could not sleep, and I have read it standing at the chart table on the bridge with the planet visible through the dome above me, hanging there like a bruise against the system's pale star. The file says the world is dead. The file says it has been dead for 41 years, since the Varath Reclamation Authority sealed the atmosphere designation and pulled the last of its survey ships out of the low-orbit buffer. The file says the colony ship that crashed there was a Terran vessel, human, a word I will return to, and that no survivors were ever confirmed, and that the ecological index had been revised downward in the first survey to Class 21, which is the authority's internal notation for a world so hostile to conventional biology that further investment is not warranted. Class 21 means the planet kills things faster than they can adapt. Class 21 means the surveyor who coined the designation was expressing, in bureaucratic shorthand, the opinion that no civilization with options would choose to remain. The file is wrong about one of those things. I know that now. I knew it somewhere around the 3rd day of the operation, when my 3rd survey team stopped transmitting, and the forest below us was quiet in a way that forests are not quiet when they are empty of anything that thinks. I am Sekorath Vel-Dashun. I hold the rank of 3rd Survey Commander in the Varath Reclamation Authority, which is a title that sounds more significant than it is. In practical terms, it means I am the officer responsible for arriving at abandoned, decommissioned, or contested sites in advance of the main reclamation fleet, conducting a preliminary ecological and structural survey, and returning a classification recommendation to the authority's central registry. I have done this 47 times over a career spanning 3 decades. I have surveyed ice fields and acid plateaus and the ruins of civilizations that burned themselves out before the authority existed. I have never lost a survey team before. I have never received a transmission from a world that the file says is empty. I want to be precise about that, because precision is what I have left. I am recording this account because 3rd Survey Commanders are required to file a full after-action narrative when a mission results in casualties, significant deviation from the operational plan, or, and this is the category that applies, contact with an unregistered intelligence or military asset. The form I am filling requires plain language. I intend to use it. Vael-Keth is the 3rd planet in the Dacier system, approximately 11 standard days transit from the nearest authority hub. It is large, approximately 1.5 times the diameter of my own homeworld, which already gives it a gravitational surface pull that our suits are calibrated to compensate for, though not comfortably. The atmosphere is breathable by the standards of most carbon-based biologies, meaning it contains the correct proportions of the correct gases, but the partial pressure is higher than comfortable, and the particulate count from the vegetation is a constant irritant to anything not evolved there. When we dropped below the cloud layer on the first morning, the world looked, briefly, beautiful. I remember thinking that. I was standing at the observation port on the bridge, and the forest below us was the color of old copper and rust red, vast and unbroken, canopy stretching to every horizon the dome permitted me to see. The rivers were dark. The cloud formations were dense and low, lit from above by the pale star, and where the light broke through the canopy gaps it came down in long columns through the particulate haze, amber and thick as poured resin. I remember thinking, it doesn't look dead. The file said it was dead, and the file had been compiled by the authority's ecological division, and the authority's ecological division is not staffed by optimists. So I set the thought aside and began the operational sequence. The plan was standard for a Class 21 reclamation survey. We do not walk into a Class 21 world without extensive preliminary reconnaissance. We deploy sensor drones first, 40 of them in this case, a standard grid pattern across the designated survey zone, and we let them run for 48 hours before we commit any personnel to the surface. The drone data tells us where the primary biological density is, where it isn't, and which corridors offer the lowest contact probability for a survey team working on foot. The ecological index might say class 21, but in practice, every world classified that high still has zones of relative passivity. The organisms that make a world lethal are not uniformly distributed. They have territories, migration patterns, seasonal behaviors. 48 hours of sensor data is usually enough to find the gaps. The drones returned their data. The data was thorough. The Ecological Division's initial survey had been conducted from high orbit 41 years ago by a crew that was, I believe the accurate description is, frightened and in a hurry. Their data was accurate as far as it went. Vael-Keth's native biology is extraordinary in its density and in its degree of predatory specialization. The world did not develop apex predators. It developed everything as an apex predator. The large herbivores, and there are several species exceeding 12 meters in length, are armored against the ground-level carnivores by integumentary plating that our standard survey rifles could not penetrate at the tested ranges. The mid-sized carnivores hunt in coordinated groups and communicate through subsonic vibration that our equipment can detect but not fully decode. The microbiological layer is aggressive in ways that required our team's medic, Varath, to revise the suit seal protocol upward on the first morning. I had never revised a suit seal protocol upward before. The standard protocol exists because 40 years of authority operations have established that it is sufficient. The revision Varath requested added 3 additional integrity checks and a chemical barrier layer that reduced the suit's manual dexterity rating by 12%. None of this was what the file said. The file said, ecological index declining, primary megafauna population reduced by estimated 70% from initial survey, biological threat assessment downgraded from active to passive in the 41-year interim. The forest below us, when we flew the initial reconnaissance pass at low altitude, did not look like the forest of a world whose biology was in decline. It looked like a forest that had been growing, unchecked, for 41 years, and was very pleased about it. I authorized the first ground team anyway. I was behind schedule. The reclamation fleet's main body was 11 days behind us, and the authority's logistics division does not appreciate scheduled deviations without documented cause, and the forest looked healthy, is not documented cause. Team 1, Assessor Drath, Recorder Veth, and 3 field technicians went down on the morning of day 2 into what the drone data had identified as a zone of low biological activity on the northern face of what the initial survey had designated as the colony crash site. The crashed Terran vessel had, 41 years ago, come down in a clearing that the impact itself had created. Clearings on Vael-Keth don't stay clearings. The vegetation had reclaimed it entirely. There was no visible debris. Whatever the colony ship had carried down with it, equipment, structures, materials, had been buried under 40 years of the planet asserting itself. Team 1 was on the surface for 6 hours. Their final transmission was a routine progress report, Drath's voice calm, noting that they had located what appeared to be a buried structural element consistent with the colony vessel's known hull materials, and that they were preparing to excavate. Standard work. The kind of transmission I have received hundreds of times. I acknowledged it and went back to my chart review. An hour later, their suit beacons went dark. Not individually, not sequentially, the way beacons go dark when an organism takes someone one at a time. All 5, within 4 seconds of each other, which is not the signature of a biological predator event. That signature, the spaced intervals, the desperate last transmissions, the localized GPS scatter as someone tries to run, I have seen that before, on worse worlds than this one. What I saw on the board was 5 beacons, in tight formation, going from active to null simultaneously, as if the team had passed through a threshold rather than been attacked. I stared at the board for a long time. Then I authorized Team 2 and told them to find out what happened to Team 1. I want to be honest about what I was thinking. I was thinking jamming. Vael-Keth's ionosphere has unusual electromagnetic properties. The initial survey had flagged this, and we had seen some signal degradation in the drone data at depth in the heavy canopy. My working assumption was that Team 1 had moved into a pocket of interference severe enough to kill the beacon signal, that they were alive and working, and that Team 2 would walk to within line of sight and re-establish contact. This was a reasonable assumption. It was also wrong, though not in the way I expected it to be wrong. Team 2, 7 personnel, because I had added numbers, found the site where Team 1 had last reported. They found the excavation. They found the exposed section of hull material. They did not find Team 1. There was no blood, no suit components, no equipment scatter. There was no sign of biological predation, no drag marks, no disturbance in the vegetation consistent with a struggle. There was the excavation, the hull section, and nothing else. Assessor Kelm, leading Team 2, described the site as tidy. She meant it as a data point. She was a precise person. The word she chose was the correct word, and it was the word that began to change my understanding of what I was dealing with. Tidy. The site had been tidied. Someone had tidied it. I called Team 2 back. They were halfway back to the extraction point when their beacons went dark too. 12 personnel on a world the file said was empty in the space of less than a day. I sat on the bridge under the dome with the copper andrust canopy below me, and I looked at the beacon board for a long time. Varath was beside me. He didn't say anything. He is a good officer. He understood that I was working through something, and that talking would not help me work through it faster. What I was working through was this. The world the file described and the world I was looking at from the bridge were not the same world. They had the same coordinates. They had the same spectral signature and the same atmospheric composition and the same geological profile. But the world the file described was a dead world, a passive world, a Class 21 world whose danger was biological and impersonal, organisms doing what organisms do, without organization, without intent. The world I was looking at had taken 24 personnel and left no trace and cleaned up after itself, and that is not what organisms do. That is what something with intent does. I want to be careful here, because accuracy requires me to note that my actual thought, at the time, was more cautious than the narrative implies. I did not yet think I understood what I was dealing with. I thought I was missing something critical, and that I needed more data before I made another decision that cost me personnel I could not recover. I deployed the reserve drones. Not in a grid. I had drone data from the grid, and the grid had not shown me what I needed to see. I deployed them in a tight surveillance ring around the crash site, at low altitude with full-spectrum sensor packages active, and the resolution scaled up to maximum. If something was moving in that forest, I intended to see it. The drones ran for 18 hours. I watched the feed for most of those hours. There is a particular quality to drone surveillance footage from a heavily forested world. It has the character of looking at something through water, the canopy refracting and obscuring, the sensor trying to resolve what the eye cannot. Vael-Keth's canopy was dense enough that the imaging systems were working at the edge of their resolution capability, stitching together partial pictures from the gap feeds and the thermal overlays and the subsonic vibration mapping. It made the footage feel assembled rather than observed. You were always aware that what you were seeing was an interpretation, that the thing underneath was something the sensor had guessed at. In the first 4 hours, the footage showed me what I expected, the normal behavior of a high-density ecological system. The megafauna moving along their established corridors, the mid-sized carnivores working the margins, the subsonic communication patterns I had flagged in the initial data. All of it consistent with a Class 21 world operating at full biological capacity. Nothing inconsistent with the updated ecological index. Nothing that required me to revise my working assumption about what had happened to my teams. In the 5th hour, the footage showed me a megafauna specimen, one of the large armored herbivores, 12 meters or more, moving east along what the topographic data showed as a natural ridge corridor, stop. Simply stop. In the middle of its corridor. It stood still for 19 minutes. Nothing was threatening it. The carnivore density in its immediate area was low. The thermal imaging showed no active predator signatures within several hundred meters. It stopped because something had asked it to stop, or because something in its environment had changed in a way my sensors were not sensitive enough to detect. And after 19 minutes it moved again, turning north, off its established corridor, heading toward denser canopy. I flagged the behavior and kept watching. In the 7th hour, I noticed the silence zones. This took me longer to notice than it should have, because silence zones are defined by an absence, and absences are harder to see than presences. What I was seeing in the subsonic vibration data was specific areas of the forest going quiet, not the normal quiet of a temporarily vacant territory, but a deeper quiet, a structured quiet in which the biological communication density dropped to near zero across a defined area, and then, after a period that ranged from minutes to a full hour, resumed. The zones were not fixed. They moved. They appeared and dissolved and reappeared elsewhere, and after I had been watching long enough, a pattern became visible. The zones were moving in response to something. They were not random. They were organized, not by the megafauna, whose territorial behavior I understood and whose communication signatures I could read, and not by the mid-tier carnivores, whose pack behavior had a different signature. They were organized by something the sensor could not directly image, something that was moving through the forest below the canopy threshold, something that the thermal overlay was not picking up because, and this took me until the 11th hour to recognize, it was not warmer than its environment. Warm-blooded biology radiates. The thermal overlay works because organisms that regulate their own temperature produce a signature against a cooler background. The background in Vael-Keth's forest floor was not cool. The ambient temperature under the canopy, with the particulate density and the atmospheric pressure and the biological heat load of a few thousand square kilometers of intensely active ecology, was high enough that an organism with the metabolic profile of the humans in my personnel roster would produce a signature approximately 12% above ambient. Detectable. The overlay should have seen it. It didn't. Because whatever was moving in the forest floor had adapted its operational signature to the ambient conditions, or was moving slowly enough that the delta was within the sensor's error margin, or was using the biology around it as thermal cover in a way that required a degree of understanding of the sensor's limitations that I was not, at the time, willing to attribute to what I thought I was looking at. In the 15th hour, a corridor of silence opened directly below one of my drones. It opened in a shape, a rough arc, concave toward the drone's position and held for 22 minutes. Then it closed. The drone's own systems had detected nothing. No proximity alert, no vibration signature, no thermal event. Whatever was below the drone during those 22 minutes did not exist, as far as the sensor was concerned. But the corridor had opened in a shape that put nothing between the corridor and the drone. An arc, concave toward the drone, which meant whatever created the corridor was aware of the drone, which meant whatever created the corridor was not creating it to move freely through the forest. It was creating it to look up. What they showed me at the end of those 18 hours was this: the forest moved. Not the way a forest with wind in it moves, not the way a forest with large animals in it moves. It moved with intention. There were corridors of stillness that appeared and disappeared in patterns too regular to be coincidental. Not the paths of animals, but the signatures of something managing the paths of animals. Something that could quiet the ecology of a Class 21 world over a specific area for a specific duration and then release it. I have no other way to describe it. The forest moved the way a city moves, not as a whole, but in coordinated parts, each part operating within a system. And on the morning of the third day, The crash site emitted a signal. It was tight beam, aimed at us with a precision that required knowing exactly where we were. It was human encoded, a standard Terran colonial frequency that the authorities' communication system flagged automatically, one I had never seen used in active operation, because that frequency had been designated legacy inactive for 3 decades. It was a voice transmission, a human voice, flat and dry and unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone reading from a prepared statement while being entirely unimpressed by the person they are reading it to. The voice said, "Varath Survey Vessel, this is Vael-Keth Colonial Defense Command. You are operating in a restricted zone without authorization. You have 14 hours to withdraw your vessel to a minimum safe distance of 200,000 kilometers. After that interval, we will no longer be responsible for the safety of any personnel you deploy to the surface. Vael-Keth Colonial Defense Command, out." There was no distress. There was no plea. There was no explanation of what had happened to my 24 missing personnel, which was the detail that bothered me most, because it implied that the detail was not considered relevant. The transmission was the transmission of an organization that had assessed the situation, determined the appropriate response, and delivered it with no emotional content whatsoever. I played it back twice. Then I played it back a third time, because I was trying to hear something in the voice that would tell me more than the words did. Military cadence. The kind of voice that has been delivering instructions to people who are not expected to argue for long enough that the expectation of non-argument has become structural. Not angry, not warning, simply informing. Colonial Defense Command. I pulled the file again. The file said that the colony ship, the Terran vessel, human registered, class designation Meridian 7 immigrant carrier, had gone down 41 years ago with an estimated complement of 800 colonists and 120 crew. The file said no survivors had been confirmed. The file said the authority had conducted 3 overflight surveys in the first decade and found no evidence of an active settlement. The file said Vael-Keth was abandoned. The world was ecologically hostile, and the designation class 21 effectively meant that survival without external resupply was not considered viable for more than a single season. The file said they were dead. The file had been compiled by people who had looked at a class 21 world and decided, reasonably, that nothing they knew would survive it. I think the people who compiled the file had not spent enough time thinking about what happens when the thing that decides to survive a Class 21 world spent 200,000 years evolving on a world that the rest of the galaxy rated Class 12 on its quieter days. I think they looked at the numbers, the predator density, the toxin index, the gravity load, the atmospheric particulate, and they ran the standard survivability model. And the standard survivability model returned a negative projection, and nobody thought to ask whether the standard survivability model was calibrated for humans. It wasn't. The standard survivability model is calibrated for us, for the kinds of biologies the authority routinely works with. It assumes a particular relationship between an organism and environmental threat, that the organism seeks to avoid the threat, mitigates it with technology when possible, and withdraws when the cost of mitigation exceeds a calculable threshold. It does not account for organisms that look at a Class 21 ecology and begin taking notes. I did not know all of this at the time. I am reconstructing it now from what I subsequently learned. At the time, what I knew was, the voice on the transmission was calm, the transmission was authoritative, 24 of my personnel had disappeared without a trace, and I had 14 hours to decide what to do. I spent 11 of those hours in genuine deliberation. I am not ashamed of that. I was working with inadequate information on a problem I had never encountered and did not fully understand, and the correct response to that situation is not speed. The correct response is to think. What I concluded at the end of 11 hours was this: I was not going to withdraw. I was a third survey commander of the Varath Reclamation Authority. The authorities' charter gives me specific obligations with respect to unclaimed and abandoned zones. Vael-Keth was in the unclaimed registry. The authorities' legal standing in the dossier system depended on our maintaining survey presence in contested or lapsed designations, because if we withdrew without a filed counterclaim, the absence would become the record. Whatever was on that surface, and I was by now forming views about what was on that surface, they had not filed a counterclaim with the authorities' registry. They had not filed anything. The only filing that existed was 41 years old and said they were dead. I composed a response transmission. I told the Colonial Defense Command that I was operating under the authorities' charter, that I acknowledged their communication, that I was obligated to continue the survey pending resolution of the designation dispute through proper channels, and that I requested a formal meeting with their command authority to begin that process. I was trying to be reasonable. I want the record to reflect that. The response came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than I expected and suggests they had been watching the transmission queue closely. The same voice, still flat, still unhurried. It said, "Varath survey vessel, your position is noted. The proper channel for designation disputes is the authorities' reclamation division. We suggest you use it. In the meantime, we have returned your 24 personnel to your extraction point. They are unharmed. We would prefer they remain so. 14-hour notice has been replaced by a standing notice. Withdraw at your convenience, but understand that any further surface deployment will be treated as hostile action. Vael-Keth Colonial Defense Command, out." I checked the extraction point. The personnel were there, all 24 of them, sitting in a neat cluster at the extraction point coordinates, suits intact, beacons reactivated. I sent a shuttle for them immediately, and I stood at the observation port while it went down, watching the forest, trying to see something in it that was not just forest. When the personnel came aboard, I debriefed them personally. All 24 individually. I wanted to understand what had happened to them, because understanding it might tell me something about what I was dealing with. The accounts were consistent, not suspiciously consistent, not the consistency of people who have been coached, but consistent in the way accounts are consistent when people experience the same thing. They had been sedated, all of them. Something in the air, they had all noted a faint aromatic compound in the suit filter warnings shortly before their beacons went dark, which they had each attributed to local organic chemistry and not flagged as significant. The compound had been sufficient, at concentrated dose, to put them under in 4 seconds. They had woken in a structure, underground they believed, based on the lack of natural light and the ambient temperature and humidity. The structure was functional, not ruined, not improvised. Functional, maintained with level floors and organized storage and environmental controls that were working. They had been placed in a medical assessment area. While they were sedated, someone had checked their suits for contamination and repaired a seal that had developed a microfracture on one of the technicians. Nobody had spoken to them. Nobody had been unkind. They had woken up, been observed for 2 hours by someone who stayed in a position that kept them in shadow and did not speak, and then been walked, not carried, walked, under their own power, back to the surface and to the extraction point and left. I want to describe what several of my personnel independently observed about the structure, because the descriptions are significant. Field technician Orath noted that the floor of the area where he woke was not bare rock or packed earth. It had a surface treatment, something applied, uniform, smooth underfoot in a way that spoke of maintenance rather than construction. He said it looked worn, the way floors look worn when people have walked on them for a long time. He estimated from the wear patterns that the floor had been in use for at least 2 decades. He is not a structural engineer, but he is competent with materials, and he was paying attention, because paying attention to surfaces is part of a field technician's training. Assessor Drath noted the storage. He had been placed in one area, but had been walked through an adjacent corridor on the way back to the surface, and the corridor had organized racking along both walls, equipment, components, sealed containers with markings in a notation he did not recognize, because it was not authority standard notation. He said the storage was dense but not cluttered. It had the organization of a system that has been refined over time, not where things were put when there was nowhere else to put them, but where things were because someone had decided that was where they belong. He noted several items he identified as authority vintage by their hull material, modified in ways he could not fully assess. He noted a larger number of items he could not identify at all. Recorder Veth noted the environmental controls. She is the most technically detailed of the 3 team leaders by training and inclination, and she spent her 2 hours of observation doing what her title implies. The temperature in the underground area was regulated, not to a standard she recognized, but regulated consistently, held within what she estimated as a 2-degree variance for the full duration of her observation. The humidity was managed. The air circulation was active. She could hear it, a faint, low sound from somewhere above, the signature of a system designed to be unobtrusive because it had been running long enough that the people who built it had made it quiet. She said, "It wasn't improvised. None of it was improvised. It was built, and it's been maintained, and there are people down there who know how all of it works because they built it." She also noted the light. The area where she woke was lit by fixtures she could not identify by design, integrated into the structural material itself, not attached to it, the way you build when you know from the beginning that the light is part of the structure. The light was warm and even without flicker, and it did not drain over the 2 hours she watched it. She concluded, tentatively, that the colony had developed a power generation system from local resources, which meant they had not only survived but developed, had extended the knowledge they came down with in directions the original colonial engineering documentation would not have specified, because that documentation had been written for a different world. Assessor Drath said, "They moved us through tunnels. There were a lot of tunnels. I don't know how far we went. The person who walked us out at the end was carrying a light, not using a suit system handheld, like a torch. She was small. She moved like she knew where every uneven section of floor was without looking." I asked, "What did she look like?" He said, "Human, young, maybe 25 standard cycles." She was wearing something that wasn't a suit, layered, dark, looked like it had been made from local materials. She had a lot of dirt on her. She didn't look at us when she dropped us at the surface. She just pointed at the sky and went back down. 25 standard cycles. The colony ship had gone down 41 years ago. 25 cycles would make her born here, on Vael-Keth, which meant the colony had not only survived, it had reproduced. It had survived long enough to have a generation that had never known anything but Vael-Keth. I sat with that for a long time. "The world is dead," the file said. And below me, through the dome, the copper andrust canopy ran to every horizon, and somewhere beneath it, a woman who had grown up on a Class 21 deathworld was walking back into a tunnel network with a handheld light, moving like she knew every uneven section of the floor without looking, and that was entirely unremarkable to her. I called my navigator. I told him I needed a long-range communication line to the authority's central registry, priority flag, because I had something to report that did not fit the standard categories. While he was setting it up, I walked to the chart table and looked at Vael-Keth's ecological index again. The numbers that the initial survey had flagged as unsurvivable: the toxin load, the predator density, the gravity coefficient, the atmospheric particulars. And I thought about what it would take to raise a child on that world. Not to survive on it. I had already revised my understanding of that probability. But to raise a child. To make a Class 21 ecology into a place where a generation could grow up, learn, grow into competence, walk tunnels in the dark without looking at the floor. What it would take to hold that for 41 years without resupply, without contact, without anyone on the outside believing you were alive. The long-range line opened. The communications officer at the Central Registry was a young clerk by his voice. He did not know what to do with my priority flag, because my priority flag was in a category unregistered military asset, confirmed human origin active designation dispute, that he had presumably never processed. He put me on hold 3 times. I waited. I had been a 3rd survey commander for 30 years, and I had learned to wait. When the senior registrar came on the line, I described the situation. I described it precisely, in the order it had occurred, without editorializing. I described the transmissions, the returned personnel, the underground structures, the personnel my teams had encountered. I described the woman with the handheld light. I described the tunnels. The senior registrar was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "3rd Survey Commander, are you telling me there is an active human settlement on Vael-Keth?" I said, "Yes, that is what I am telling you." She said, "A settlement that has been there for 41 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "On a Class 21 world." I said, "Yes." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "3rd Survey Commander, the authority is going to need to assemble a formal contact delegation. This falls outside your operational mandate. I am going to flag this for escalation. Please hold your current position and do not conduct any further surface deployments." I said I would hold position. I did not say, "That is what I intended to do anyway," and not only because the Colonial Defense Command asked me to, but because I have been watching the forest below me for 3 days, and I have slowly arrived at the understanding that I am not the most competent entity in this situation. I did not say that. I noted the instruction and ended the call. I held position for 8 days. The formal contact delegation took 4 days to assemble and 4 days to transit, which is genuinely fast for the authority's bureaucratic apparatus and reflects, I believe, the degree to which the senior registrar had escalated the priority flag. The delegation was 9 officials, 3 legal analysts, 2 ecological specialists, and this is the detail that told me how seriously the authority was taking this, a military observer. A Varath fleet captain named Varath Orlis, 4 decades of service, a name I knew from the senior officers' registry. Fleet Captain Orlis did not explain why a military observer was included in a contact delegation for a human settlement. She didn't need to. The delegation made contact with the Colonial Defense Command through the established transmission channel. The Colonial Defense Command agreed to a meeting. The meeting would take place on the surface, at coordinates they specified, at a time they specified. The delegation would come down in a single shuttle, unarmed, with no more than 12 persons. I was included in the 12. I was included because I had conducted the preliminary survey, and the Colonial Defense Command had specifically requested my presence, which was something I learned from the delegation's lead official and which I found notable. They had asked for me by name. I had transmitted to them on a voice channel. They had listened carefully enough to identify me as the decision-making officer and request my continued involvement. I filed that observation away with all the others. We went down on a clear morning, clear by Vael-Keth standards, which means the overcast was high enough that the pale star's light came through relatively undiffused, amber and thin, casting the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. The coordinates the Colonial Defense Command had specified were in a section of the forest I hadn't surveyed, farther north than Team 1's site, on the far side of what the topographic data indicated was a significant ridge. When the shuttle cleared the ridge, I saw why they had chosen the location. Below us was a city. Not the ruins of a city, not the remnant of a city, a city. 40 years of growth and construction layered over the original crash site, built outward from it in deliberate concentric rings, using materials that were partly salvaged and partly native. The rust-red timber of the local hardwood species that the Ecological Survey had noted was as dense as stone, fitted together with a precision that spoke of both tools and long practice. The structures were low and wide, adapted to the gravity, and they were heavily covered, not buried but canopied, the local vegetation incorporated into the rooflines in ways that were not accidental, that served a purpose, that were managed. From altitude, the city would have been nearly invisible in the forest. From a drone's sensor package at low altitude, it would have read as undifferentiated biological density. The 3 overflight surveys the authority had conducted in the first decade would have seen nothing. They had built an invisible city. They had been building it for 40 years, while the authorities' file said they were dead, and they had made it invisible because they understood that no one they wanted to be found by would be looking, and so the only people who would look were the ones they didn't want to be found by. Fleet Captain Orlis, beside me at the observation port, said nothing. Her color, which I can read as well as I can read my own species, had shifted slightly. There is a specific shift in the Varath integumentary pattern that indicates the recalibration of an assumption. I had seen it in myself, in reflective surfaces, over the past 8 days. I recognized it in her now. The shuttle set down in a cleared area that I understood on landing had been cleared for us. Recently, precisely, the native vegetation pulled back to a specific perimeter and no further. Standing at the perimeter, in a loose arrangement that was not quite a formation and not quite casual, were approximately 30 humans. They were wearing the same layered, dark, locally sourced clothing as the woman Assessor Drath had described. They were of varying ages. I could see individuals who appeared elderly, and individuals who appeared to be children, and every range between. They were not armed, visibly. They did not look at us the way species look at first contact encounters in the registry's historical documentation, not with awe, not with excitement, not with fear. They looked at us with the particular attention of people who have decided to be here and have thought carefully about what they intend to say. Standing at the front of the group was a man. Old by human reckoning, I would learn later he was one of the original colonists, 63 standard cycles, which humans call ancient for their species, but which, looking at him, seemed like a description that did not fit. He was broad across the shoulders, not tall, with the kind of build that results from decades of functional labor in high gravity. His hair was gray and cut short, and his face had been rearranged by time, and a Class 21 world into something that the authorities' file would not have recognized as the passenger manifest photo I had seen. He was standing in the open air of a planet that the file said would kill conventional biology inside a season, and he looked like he had been standing in that air his entire life because he had been. Behind him, to his left, was the woman from Assessor Drath's description. Not young. I had misjudged the age estimate at second hand, or the passage of 8 days had clarified something in my understanding. 25 Vael-Keth cycles is not the same duration as 25 standard cycles. She was watching us with the same attention as the rest of the group, and in her hands, held loose at her side, was a piece of equipment I recognized after a moment as a modified survey recorder, authority manufacture, 40 years old, salvaged from the colony ship. She was recording the meeting, methodically, the way a person records something they have been assigned to record by an organization that keeps records. The old man said, in Varath standard, with the accent of someone who learned the language from a text and has never spoken it to a native speaker, but has spoken it enough that he is no longer self-conscious about it. Third Survey Commander Sekorath, thank you for coming down. He knew my name. He had known it before I was in the 12. I said, Commander, thank you for the invitation. He nodded once, which is a human gesture I had encountered in the registry documentation and which, in context, conveyed acknowledgement and nothing excess. He said, we should talk about the designation. We talked for 3 days. I am not going to reproduce the full content of those conversations in this report, because the legal and political dimensions of the designation dispute are the province of the authorities' reclamation division and the formal contact delegation, and they are handling it. What I will say is that the humans of Vael-Keth, who call the world Vael-Keth, which surprised me until the old man explained that it was the name from the initial survey, and that they had decided to keep it because it was accurate, and they had always found the Class 21 designation accurate, were not interested in the designation dispute in the way the authorities' delegation had expected them to be interested in it. The delegation's lead official had come prepared to negotiate. She had a framework, a counterclaim filing, a residency designation, a negotiated autonomy arrangement, a potential authority charter membership. She had been doing this work for 30 years and she was good at it. The framework she had built was genuinely equitable, as these frameworks go. It acknowledged the colony's presence, acknowledged their 41 years of occupation, and offered them a legal status within the authority's structure that would give them protections and representation. The old man listened to the full presentation. He listened carefully, which I noticed because he was very still while he listened, the kind of stillness that is not passivity but attention. When the lead official finished, he said, "That's a generous offer." The lead official said, "We believe it reflects the situation fairly." He said it reflects one version of the situation. He paused. The version where Vael-Keth needs something from the authority. The lead official said, "Most settlements benefit from." He said, "We have been here for 41 years." He said it without heat. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or change his posture or do any of the things that in my experience indicate that a speaker is making an emotional argument. He simply said the fact, the duration, the bare number in the same tone he had used to say every other sentence, and let the fact sit in the air between us. He said, "We have held this world for 41 years without resupply, without contact, without the authority acknowledging we existed. We built a city. We raised a generation. We learned this planet well enough that your survey teams didn't find us until we let them." He paused again. "We are not applying for membership. We are notifying you that we exist. The designation dispute you're describing is not a dispute. We have occupied and held and defended this territory for longer than the authorities' lapse claim statute requires. Vael-Keth is ours. The paperwork needs to catch up." The lead official looked at Fleet Captain Orlis. Orlis was looking at the old man. The integumentary shift I had noted in her above the city was still there. It had deepened. She said, "Defended against whom?" The old man said, "Each other at first, then the ecology, then twice against parties who arrived with the same intention your fleet arrived with." I looked at him. I said, "Other survey teams." He said, "Other parties, not your authority. We did not ask their names and they did not volunteer them. They found us the way you found us, by following the designation filing. A dead world, a crashed colony ship, no recorded survivors. The Dacier system has resources the authority hasn't cataloged yet. We noticed that before the file was compiled. So did other parties." He said, "They are not here anymore." He said it in the same tone, flat, unhurried, entirely without satisfaction or drama. It was the most frightening sentence I had heard on Vael-Keth, and Vael-Keth had given me a very wide field of comparison. Not here anymore. On a Class 21 world, with a garrison that had been building underground tunnels and invisible cities for 41 years and knew every uneven section of the floor without looking. I want to describe the meeting's conclusion accurately, because the conclusion is what I need the authorities' senior staff to understand. On the third day, the old man, his name was Commander Alden Marsh, and his title was not honorary, and he held it because Vael-Keth Colonial Defense Command was a real organization with a command structure, and a chain of authority and a documentation system that the young woman with the survey recorder was maintaining. Brought us to the edge of the city and showed us the perimeter. The perimeter was not a wall. It was something more complicated than a wall, integrated with the forest itself over 40 years of deliberate cultivation. There were elements of it I could identify and elements I could not. The elements I could identify included sensor emplacements, some using Authority vintage components salvaged from the colony ship, and some using components I did not recognize the manufacturer of. There were elevated observation positions in the canopy, occupied by personnel I could not see until Commander Marsh indicated them, at which point I could see them precisely because they were not hiding from me anymore. They were simply still, in a forest where stillness is a practiced art. There were defensive corridors that used the native megafauna as it became apparent, a managed element rather than a hazard. The animals moved within patterns that the Garrison understood, and to a degree I was still trying to fully comprehend, influenced. Fleet Captain Orlis stood at the perimeter edge for a long time. She was looking at the forest. The forest was what it had always been, from up here, copper and rust red, canopy dense and unbroken, the amber light coming through in long columns. She was looking at it differently than she had looked at it from the bridge. She was looking at it the way you look at something once you understand it is looking back. She said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "How many?" Commander Marsh said, "Enough." He said it without pride, without performance. He said it the way someone states a logistical fact that has been verified and does not require elaboration. Orlis said, "And if we had not withdrawn?" Marsh said, "You did withdraw, your people came back. That's the outcome we prefer." He let that sit. Then he said, "We have been on this world for 41 years. We have lost people, a lot of people early on while we were learning. The planet took them before we understood it well enough to hold them. We understand it now. We hold it now." A pause. "We do not want a war with the Varath Authority. We do not want a war with anyone. We want the designation updated and to be left alone. Both of those things are straightforward." I asked him, on the third day, about the learning. Because the learning was the thing I could not fully account for, and I had been a third survey commander for 30 years, and I understood that the thing I could not account for was the thing the report needed to address. He thought about how to answer. He was not the kind of person who answered questions before he had decided how to answer them. He sat in the long quiet of what I had come to understand was the colony's council room, the largest enclosed space in the surface structures, which was not large, which had been built for function and not for impression. And he looked at his hands for a moment, which is a human gesture I did not find in the registry documentation, but which I recognized as someone taking inventory. He said, "In the first winter we lost 63 people to the large predators. We had weapons. We had training. We had surveyed data from the pre-crash remote imaging which was not detailed enough to be useful. We lost 63 people because we were moving through a world we did not understand, in ways the world's biology had not encountered before, and its biology responded to novelty the same way everything on this planet responds to novelty." A pause. "Aggressively." He said, "We stopped moving. That was the first thing we learned. Stop moving because moving in a pattern is legible. A thing that moves in a pattern is a thing the ecology can model. Once the ecology models you, it hunts you. So we stopped. We held ground. We defended a perimeter, and we did not expand it until we understood what was on the other side of it." He said, "Then we started watching, not moving, just watching. We had people whose job was to sit in one place for a full day cycle and do nothing except observe. Not take notes, observe. Notes are a layer between you and the thing you're observing. We found that out when we tried note-taking first and kept missing things because we were looking at the page." He looked at the young woman. She was his daughter. I had learned, born on Vael-Keth in the colony's 4th year, which made her 37 cycles, not 25, and the discrepancy in Assessor Drath's estimate reflected the difficulty of aging a human who grew up in conditions that marked the body differently than a standard developmental environment. and said, Sira has spent more hours watching this forest than she has spent sleeping. Sira did not look up from the recorder. He said, the third thing we learned is that the biology here is not hostile in the way hostile is usually used. Hostile implies intent directed at you. Vael-Keth's biology is just thorough. It fills available space. It exploits available resources. It's been filling space and exploiting resources for longer than our civilization has been writing things down. We are resources. When we stopped looking like easy resources and started looking like costs, the biology adjusted. Not everything adjusted. The megafauna don't really think about us much now, which is an outcome we worked for. The mid-tier carnivores gave us trouble for the first 15 years, and then they stopped. And we're still not entirely sure if that's because they learned or because the generations that lost too many pack members hunting us preferentially selected for groups that hunted something else. He paused. Either way, the outcome is what matters. He said, what we didn't expect was what we became, learning all of that. You lose people in the early years and you don't lose them in ways that make good stories. You lose them to small things, to mistakes that seem like they shouldn't be fatal. You learn that everything here is calibrated to the assumption that life is expensive and waste is not tolerated, and so you become that too. You calibrate. You stop tolerating waste. You stop making the small mistakes because the small mistakes here compound in ways that they don't on more forgiving worlds. He said, after a while, the calibration isn't something you're doing anymore. It's just who you are. He said, my daughter has never made a mistake on Vael-Keth that cost anyone anything. She has been on this world for 37 years, and she has never made that mistake. I don't say that because I'm her father. I say it because it is a verifiable fact that the record will confirm, and the record is complete. He looked at me then. The specific quality of his attention, the kind of attention that has been in high-gravity, high-threat conditions long enough that it is constitutively different from ordinary attention, was something I had felt from him intermittently over 3 days, but this was the first time he directed it at me without any surrounding conversation to diffuse it. It was uncomfortable, not aggressive, simply very complete. He said, Third Survey Commander, you are a careful person. I noticed that when you pulled your second team back, and when you held position after receiving our communication. Those were correct decisions, and they were not obvious decisions. The obvious decision was to push forward. He said, the thing that keeps people alive on this world is making the correct decision when the obvious decision would kill you. You have been making that decision since you arrived. A pause. We noticed. I did not say anything. I am noting this exchange because it is the only moment in the 3 days of meetings when I felt the nature of the gap, the specific nature of the gap between what the authorities' framework understood and what the humans of Vael-Keth were directly. It was not threatening. It was not intended to be threatening. It was simply an observation from a man who had been assessing the decision-making quality of potential threats for 4 decades on a world that did not forgive incorrect assessments, and who was telling me, flat and without heat, that I had passed a threshold. Not their threshold. A threshold he was describing because he thought I was competent enough to hear it without misreading it. I heard it, I did not misread it. Orlis said, the authority will need guarantees. Marsh said, the authority is welcome to send a delegation. The authority's delegation is here. We have guaranteed them hospitality and returned your survey teams and conducted these conversations in good faith. The guarantee is the 41 years. He said, what else would you like us to do? Orlis had no answer to that. I did not have an answer to that. The lead official had an answer, she had several answers, she had a framework, but the old man had shifted the frame, quietly, without heat, over 3 days of conversation, until we were not in the authorities' framework anymore. We were in his. This is what the report needs to convey. Not the legal dimensions, those are for the division. Not the political dimensions, those are for the councils. What the report needs to convey is this: the humans of Vael-Keth are not a settlement in distress. They are not a colony awaiting rescue. They are an organized, competent, multi-generational community that has held a Class 21 world by force of will and thoroughness for 41 years, and they are not asking permission to exist. They are notifying us that they exist, because they have decided that the notification is now appropriate, and they have decided that because they are done. Done with what? With the period during which concealment served them better than declaration. The tunnels, the invisible city, the managed perimeter, all of that is still there, still functional, still maintained. But Commander Marsh is 63 years old and he was not born on Vael-Keth, and the generation that was born on Vael-Keth is old enough now to run it. And what he is doing, what the transmissions and the meetings and the returned personnel and the 3 days of flat, unhurried conversation represent, is a transition. He is opening the door because the next generation doesn't need to keep it shut. The young woman with the survey recorder, the personnel we encountered in the tunnels, the ones who carried my people underground, checked their suits, repaired the fractured seal, walked them back to the extraction point, pointed at the sky. The ones standing at the perimeter in the forest, still invisible until they stopped hiding. They grew up here. They grew up learning what this world was, what it required, what it cost. They learned it young enough that it stopped being something they survived and became something they simply were. The Class 21 designation is not a threat assessment to them. It is a description of home. I cannot fully convey what that understanding did to my sense of the situation. I have surveyed 47 worlds. I have read the ecological indices of hundreds more. I have worked within the authorities' framework for 30 years, and the framework has always been adequate to the situation, because the situations have always, ultimately, been about resources and territory and legality, and those things have answers. The situation on Vael-Keth has answers too. I believe it does. I believe the legal path exists. But arriving at those answers requires the authority to first accept a premise that the framework was not built to accommodate. The premise is this: there is a human garrison on Vael-Keth. It is armed, it is organized, it is competent, and it is not in distress. It did not call for help. It did not file a claim because it did not need to file a claim. It held the ground, and ground that is held for 41 years on a world the claimant never leaves is held. The designation in the authorities' registry is incorrect. The world is not dead. It has not been dead since the colony ship went down. The humans on it made very sure of that, at considerable cost, over a very long time, and they were thorough about it the way they are apparently thorough about everything, including returning my personnel in better condition than they found them. I am required, as part of this report, to provide a recommendation for the authorities' formal response. My recommendation is simple: update the designation, acknowledge the counterclaim, negotiate the autonomy arrangement with the understanding that the humans of Vael-Keth are not applicants, and the authority is not conferring a benefit but ratifying a reality. Send a delegation that understands this. Do not send survey teams without explicit advance authorization from Colonial Defense Command, because Colonial Defense Command will continue to treat unauthorized surface deployment as hostile action and will act accordingly. And they have demonstrated the capability to act accordingly in ways that leave no trace and return the personnel unharmed. And the emphasis there should be on the word demonstrated. Fleet Captain Orlis and I rode back to the survey vessel in the shuttle in silence. We came up through the cloud layer and the forest fell away below us, copper and rust red, vast and unbroken, and I watched it until the dome closed over it, and there was only the pale star above and the black beyond. After a long time, Orlis said, 41 years. I said, yes. She said, on a Class 21 world. I said, yes. She looked out at the star. She said, 3rd Survey Commander, I have 39 years of service. I have been in 6 engagements. I have operated on or above 16 worlds with active threat designations. She said, I would like to update my understanding of what a threat designation means. I didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer to give. Below us, Vael-Keth turned in the pale light, and somewhere beneath the canopy, a garrison that the file said was dead was continuing to do what it had been doing for 41 years, which was hold the ground, maintain the tunnels, walk the perimeter, and exist on a world that everything in the authorities' framework said they could not exist on. The file was wrong, the garrison was right. That is all I have to add. The rest is paperwork, and the division can handle paperwork. What the division cannot do, and what I believe someone with the authority to make decisions needs to understand before the formal contact proceeds, is feel the weight of it. The specific weight of what it means to stand at the perimeter of a city you cannot see, in a forest that is watching you, on a world that should by every reasonable estimate have killed everyone on it 4 decades ago, and understand that the people who built that city and survived that forest and managed that world are still there. Still watching, and they have been patient for 41 years, and patience is a thing you learn, not a thing you are born with, and what you learn it from shapes what it costs. They learned it from Vael-Keth. That is sufficient explanation, I think, for everything that followed.